The clang of the hammer was Jack Cade's prayer, his penance, and his only conversation. Each strike against the glowing steel was a word he could no longer speak, a memory he tried to beat into submission. In the smoky heart of his smithy, under the disapproving gaze of the mountains that ringed the town of redemption, he forged horseshoes and repaired wagon wheels, his life measured in the steady rhythm of a man determined to forget who he had once been. The sweat that beaded on his brow and traced paths through the soot on his arms was an ablution washing away the ghosts of gun smoke and the copper tang of blood. Redemption. The name was a bitter joke, a daily reminder of what he could never truly have. He'd chosen this place for its name, hoping the irony would eventually fade into simple truth. It never had. The splintered boardwalks groaned under the weight of secrets, and the setting sun bled across the horizon each evening, painting the adobe walls in hues of rust and regret. For 5 years Jack had lived this quiet life, his past locked away, like a gun in a dusty case. The holster at his hip was long gone, but its ghost remained an empty space that ached on cold mornings. He was just the blacksmith now, a man with calloused hands and a silence that went deeper than his quiet nature. The noon sun was high and unforgiving, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the dust of the main street into a fine, pale powder. Jack was quenching a freshly forged plowshare, the hiss of steam, a satisfying sigh of completion, when the first gunshot cracked the sleepy stillness of the day. It was sharp, authoritative, and utterly out of place. Another followed, then a third, and the fragile piece of redemption shattered like cheap glass. A woman screamed. Doors slammed shut. The street moments before, dotted with townsfolk going about their business, was suddenly empty, a barren stage for the violence that had just erupted. Jack's head snapped up, his body tensing with an instinct he had fought for years to suppress. His hand drifted to his hip, his fingers curling around the empty air where the worn leather of a Colt's grip should have been. It was a ghost of a forgotten life, a reflex that sent a cold jolt through him. The commotion was centered on the Redemption Bank, and Trust, its windows now jagged teeth of broken glass. Men in long dusters, their faces obscured by bandanas, spilled from the entrance, their pistols barking at the sky. They moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of experience. One of them hefted a heavy canvas sack, the jingle of coins a cruel counterpoint to the rising panic. Their leader stood apart, directing the chaos with an unnerving calm. He was taller than the others, his movements fluid and confident. Even from a distance, Jack could sense an aura of command about him, a theatrical flair in the way he surveyed his work. He wasn't just a brute. He was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of fear. Jack stayed in the shadows of his smithy, his knuckles white where he gripped his hammer. This wasn't his fight. He had sworn it. He had buried the man who answered violence with violence on a windswept hill just outside of town, next to a grave marked with a simple wooden cross. But then the leader did something strange. Instead of mounting his horse and riding off with the loot, he strode across the street to the sheriff's office. He kicked the door open with a contemptuous thud and disappeared inside. A moment later, another shot rang out from within the office, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Sheriff Miller, a good man who had grown old and soft in a town that had forgotten what real trouble looked like, was no match for this kind of predator. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. He had to do something. But what the man he was now had no weapons, no authority, only a crushing weight of guilt he carried like a shroud. The outlaw leader emerged from the sheriff's office. He wasn't carrying another bag of money. He held a small, dark object in his gloved hand. He paused on the boardwalk, holding it up to the light. The sun caught it, and a glint of silver flashed across the street, a brilliant, blinding star that struck Jack Cade with the force of a physical blow. It was a locket. A small, simple silver locket, oval-shaped with a delicate floral engraving on its surface. The world around Jack went silent. The shouts, the gunshots, the frantic whinnying of horses It all faded into a dull, distant roar. The heat of the forge, the smell of coal and hot metal vanished. He was standing in the cold, thin air of a mountain pass 5 years ago, the scent of pine and gunpowder sharp in his nostrils. He saw his wife Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of love and fear. He felt the weight of the locket in his own hand as he had placed it around her neck that morning. "So you'll always have a piece of my heart with you," he'd said. "To bring you home safe." The outlaw leader Silas Kane, though Jack did not yet know his name, seemed to look directly at him from across the street. He couldn't have seen Jack in the deep shadows of the smithy, but his gaze felt like a physical touch, cold and deliberate. He casually tucked the silver locket into his vest pocket, then swung into his saddle with an easy grace. "Redemption." His voice boomed across the empty street, laced with a cruel, mocking amusement. "A lovely sentiment, but some debts can never be paid." With a whoop and a final volley of gunfire into the air, Silas and his men spurred their horses thundering out of town in a choking cloud of dust, leaving behind a shattered bank, a terrified populace, and a man whose carefully constructed world had just been burned to the ground. The hammer fell from Jack's numb fingers, clattering onto the packed dirt floor. The sound was deafening in the sudden silence. The theft of the town's money was a crime. The theft of that locket was a desecration. It was not a random act of plunder. It was a message delivered with surgical precision, aimed at the one secret wound Jack Cade thought he had hidden from the world. Someone knew his past. Someone had reached into his soul and ripped open a scar that would never truly heal. The blacksmith was dead. The man who stood in the cooling embers of the forge was someone else entirely. He was the man he had promised Sarah he would never be again. He was a ghost called back from the grave by the theft of a silver locket. He walked to the back of the smithy, to a heavy oak chest buried beneath a pile of old burlap sacks and discarded tools. He brushed away the debris, his movements stiff and mechanical. The lock was rusted, but the hinges groaned open. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, lay a Colt Peacemaker, its walnut grip smooth and familiar against his palm. Beside it, a gun belt, its leather cracked, but still strong, coiled like a sleeping serpent. Trouble finds men who look for it. He thought the words a hollow echo in his mind. I stopped looking. But trouble had not stopped looking for him. He strapped the belt around his waist. The weight of it was both a burden and a comfort, a piece of his old self settling back into place. He checked the action on the Colt, the metallic clicks sounding like a clock ticking backward, undoing 5 years of peace in 5 seconds. Sheriff Miller staggered out of his office, a bloody gash on his forehead, his face ashen. He saw Jack standing at the edge of the smithy, the gun on his hip, stark and undeniable. Miller's eyes, filled with the dawning horror of a man who had just seen his town violated, widened further in recognition. He wasn't looking at the town blacksmith anymore. He was looking at U.S. Marshal Cade, a man rumored to have cleaned out more outlaw dens than any lawman in the territory before he had simply vanished. "Jack." Miller began, his voice raspy. He took evidence. From the old lockbox. A locket. "I know." Jack said, his voice a low growl rough from disuse. He didn't need to ask how the locket had ended up in an evidence box. After the incident, it would have been collected as part of the official report. A relic of a tragedy. He strode past the sheriff without another word, his steps purposeful, his gaze fixed on the cloud of dust settling on the horizon. The people of Redemption peered from their windows, their faces pale with fear and confusion, watching the quiet blacksmith transform before their eyes. The man walking down the center of the street was not the one they knew. This man had shoulders squared for a fight, eyes as hard as tempered steel, and a purpose that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. He was walking back into the hell he had barely escaped, pulled by the silver chain of a stolen memory. Redemption was over. The reckoning had just begun. The trail was an open wound, cut into the sun-scorched earth, leading away from the violated town and into the vast, indifferent wilderness. Jack rode with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who understood that vengeance was a meal best served cold. But the fire in his gut burned hot enough to melt steel. His horse, a powerful roan named Vulcan, moved beneath him with a familiar rhythm, the creak of saddle leather, a lonely percussion in the immense silence of the plains. The world out here was elemental and honest. Splintered rock, stubborn sagebrush, and a sky so wide and blue it felt like a judgment. It was a landscape that mirrored Jack's own soul, weathered, scarred, and stripped down to its essential truths. For 5 years he had confined himself to the small, predictable world of redemption. The 4 walls of his smithy, a sanctuary from this unforgiving vastness. Now he was a part of it again, and the transition felt as seamless as it was painful. Like donning a perfectly fitted but agonizing hair shirt. As Vulcan picked his way through a dry arroyo, Jack allowed the memories to come. He had held them at bay for so long, dammed them up behind a wall of relentless work and willed silence. But Silas Kane's sacrilege had broken the levee. The images flooded him sharp and vivid, as if they had happened only yesterday. Sarah. Her laughter was the sound of wind chimes in a summer breeze. Her touch the gentle warmth of sunshine on his face after a long winter. He saw her standing in the doorway of their small homestead, her hands dusted with flour, a smudge on her cheek he longed to wipe away. He was a U.S. Marshal then, a man who believed in the simple, brutal arithmetic of justice. He dealt in absolutes, good and evil, law and chaos. Sarah was his anchor, the quiet center of his violent world, the reason he fought so hard to make it safe. The gang he was hunting, the Barlow brothers, were nothing special. Vicious, stupid men driven by greed. He'd tracked them for weeks, finally cornering them in a high mountain pass. He told Sarah to stay in the nearby town to wait for him. But she had worried. She had followed him, wanting to be sure he was safe, wanting to bring him a hot meal. She had ridden into the crossfire. He remembered the confusion, the thunder of guns echoing off the canyon walls, the acrid smell of black powder. He remembered seeing a flash of her blue dress among the pines. He had screamed her name, a raw, desperate sound that was swallowed by the gunfire. The bullet that killed her had come from a Barlow gun, the official report had stated. But in the dark, honest corners of his heart, Jack knew the truth. If he hadn't been there, if his life hadn't been a magnet for violence, she would still be alive. His justice, his righteousness, his gun, they had killed her as surely as the outlaws lead. He had brought the violence to her. He had broken his promise to keep her safe. He'd resigned his commission the next day, burying his badge with her. He had drifted for a year, a hollowed-out man, before finding the town of redemption, and a new name for himself, blacksmith. A man who created, who mended, who built. A man who was the opposite of the destroyer he had been. A glint of metal in the dirt ahead pulled him from his reverie. He dismounted, his joints stiff. It was a spent .44 caliber cartridge, the same type used by Silas's men. They were careless, confident they weren't being followed. Or the more chilling thought occurred to him, they wanted to be followed. This was all part of the performance. He followed the trail for 2 days, the sun a merciless hammer overhead. He moved on instinct, his old skills returning with a grim familiarity. A broken branch here, a hastily discarded cheroot, there the distinct print of a shod horse. With a nick in its shoe, the wilderness spoke to him in a language he had tried to forget, and he found he was still fluent. On the 3rd day, the flat plains began to buckle and rise into the rugged foothills of the San Juan Mountains. The trail led toward an old, abandoned mining town called Purgatory Flats. Another town with a name like a cruel joke. It was a place where prospectors' dreams had come to die, a collection of skeletal buildings slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. It was the perfect place for outlaws to hole up. Before riding into the town, he stopped in Redemption one last time under the cover of dusk. He needed supplies, and he needed to see for himself the state of the town he had, however, reluctantly come to care for. He tied Vulcan in a stand of cottonwoods and slipped into the back alleyways, moving like a phantom. The town was quiet, but it was a tense, fearful silence. Lights burned behind drawn curtains. The saloon was nearly empty. He made his way to the general store, but paused when he saw a light in the small schoolhouse next door. Through the window, he could see Eliza Thorne, the town's schoolteacher, cleaning chalk from a slate board. She had arrived in Redemption a year after him, a beacon of prim Eastern hope in a town of weathered pragmatists. She had soft brown hair that she kept pinned in a severe bun that couldn't quite contain its rebellious curls, and eyes the color of warm honey that saw more than most. She had tried to befriend the silent blacksmith, bringing him books and attempting to draw him into conversation, her gentle persistence, a quiet assault on the walls he'd built around himself. He had always kept her at a polite distance, afraid that her light would only serve to illuminate his own darkness. He watched her for a moment, a wave of regret washing over him. She represented the life he had tried to build and the peace he had now been forced to abandon. Leaving Redemption this time felt different from when he'd first arrived. This time he was leaving something behind that mattered more than just a quiet existence. His business was not with her, however. He slipped around to the back of the sheriff's office. Miller was there, sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. "Jack." Miller looked up, his face haggard. "They're holed up at Purgatory Flats." Jack said, his voice low. "I need ammunition, Jerky, and a second pistol." Miller nodded, not questioning him. He unlocked a heavy cabinet and pulled out boxes of cartridges and a Navy Colt. "Silas Kane." Miller said, his voice heavy. "That's his name. I looked him up in the old federal files. He's got a reputation. Smart, vicious. More than just a bank robber. He enjoys the cruelty." "I know," Jack said, loading the second pistol and tucking it into his belt. "This isn't about money." "What is it about, Jack?" Jack paused, the silver locket flashing in his mind's eye. "It's about a ghost." He turned to leave. "The town's scared," Jack Miller called after him. "People are whispering. They saw you with that gun. They remember the stories. Some are saying you brought this trouble on us." Jack didn't turn around. "Maybe they're right," he said, and slipped back into the night. The ride to Purgatory Flats was grim. Miller's words echoed in his head. "You brought this trouble on us." It was the same accusation he'd been leveling at himself for 5 years. He reached the outskirts of the ghost town as the moon, a cold silver sliver, rose over the jagged peaks. The buildings were dark, hunched shapes against the starry sky, their empty windows like vacant eyes. A single light burned in the largest structure, the old saloon. He dismounted, leaving Vulcan hidden in a thicket of scrub oak, and approached on foot, his boots making no sound on the dusty ground. He circled the saloon, his Colt drawn. Through a grimy window, he saw 3 of Silas's men sitting around a table playing cards. Silas was not among them. Jack needed one of them, alive, needed answers. He found a loose board at the back of the building and slipped inside, moving through the shadows like a wraith. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. He crept behind the long, rotting bar. One of the men, a hulking brute with a scarred face, stood up to relieve himself out the back. It was the opportunity Jack needed. As the man pushed through the swinging doors of the back room, Jack was on him. He brought the barrel of his Colt down hard on the man's head. The outlaw crumpled without a sound. Jack dragged him deeper into the darkness, gagging him with his own bandana. When the man came to, he found himself staring into the cold, unforgiving eyes of Jack Cade and the unwavering muzzle of a peacemaker. "Where is Silas Kane?" Jack's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the chilling authority of a judge pronouncing a death sentence. The man's eyes were wide with terror. He shook his head, mumbling against the gag. "And where is my locket?" Jack pressed the gun harder against the man's temple. The outlaw's bravado crumbled. He began to sweat, his fear palpable in the close, dark space. Jack ripped the gag away. "He ain't here," the man gasped. "He rode out. He's got business, back in Redemption." A cold dread washed over Jack. "What business?" "I don't know. He just said he had to finish the story." The man was trembling now. "He left us here to wait for you. He knew you'd come. He said to tell you something when you did." "Tell me what?" The outlaw swallowed hard, his eyes darting around nervously. "He said to tell you that Jacob Kane sends his regards, and that a brother's love is a powerful thing." Jacob Kane. The name hit Jack like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The world tilted on its axis. He stumbled back, the face of a young man flashing in his memory. A boy, really. No older than 17. One of the Barlow brothers. The youngest one. The one who had hesitated, who had looked like he was in over his head. The one who had raised his gun in a moment of panicked confusion during the shootout in the mountain pass. The one Jack had shot and killed without a second thought. Jacob. Silas Kane was Jacob's older brother. The bank robbery, the stolen locket, the deliberate trail. The men left here as bait. It all snapped into place with horrifying clarity. This was never about money. This was never a random act of violence. This was a meticulously crafted play, a 5-year-long vendetta reaching its final terrible act. Silas hadn't just come for a locket. He had come for Jack's soul. And the stage for his final performance was not this dusty ghost town. It was Redemption. "He's been there for months." The outlaw babbled, sensing his chance. "Living under another name. A respectable businessman he was. Buying up folks' debts, making friends, turning them against you real subtle-like. He's been waiting for the right moment to pull you back into the fire." Jack stared at the man, but he didn't see him. He saw Silas moving through the streets of Redemption, shaking hands, smiling his charismatic smile, all the while planting the seeds of Jack's destruction. He had been living amongst them, a wolf in sheep's clothing, manipulating the town Jack had tried to protect, turning it into a weapon against him. He had to get back, now. He left the outlaw tied and gagged in the darkness. He would live. Jack wasn't a killer anymore. Not unless he had to be. He burst out of the saloon, his mind racing. He had walked right into Silas's trap. He had been playing the part written for him all along, the lone, vengeful gunslinger. While he was out here chasing ghosts, Silas was in Redemption, tightening the noose. He sprinted toward the scrub oak where he'd left Vulcan. He had to ride harder than he'd ever ridden in his life. He was no longer just hunting a man. He was racing to save the soul of a town, and perhaps what was left of his own. The wind howled through the skeletal buildings of Purgatory Flats, a mournful, lonely sound. It sounded like a warning. The ride back to Redemption was a frantic, desperate prayer against time. Jack pushed Vulcan to the limits of his endurance, the horse's powerful lungs heaving its hooves, devouring the miles. The moon, his only companion, cast long, distorted shadows that danced at the edge of his vision like specters of his past failures. Silas's words, relayed by his captured henchmen, echoed in Jack's mind. A brother's love is a powerful thing. It was a love twisted into a monstrous obsession, a poison that had been seeping into the heart of his town. While he'd been blindly hammering out his penance, he galloped into the town limits as the first pale light of dawn bruised the eastern sky. Redemption was eerily quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath, not of peace. The whispers Sheriff Miller had warned him about had festered in his absence. As he rode down the main street, windows remained shuttered. Doors stayed closed. He saw faces peeking from behind curtains, but they were not friendly. They were the faces of people who had been fed a diet of fear and suspicion. He was no longer their quiet blacksmith. He was the lightning rod that had drawn the storm. Silas's poison had worked perfectly. He dismounted in front of the smithy, the familiar smell of cold iron and coal dust doing little to soothe his frayed nerves. He needed a plan, but his mind was a maelstrom of anger and fear. Fear not for himself, but for Eliza, for Sheriff Miller, for the decent, simple people of the town who had been turned into pawns in Silas Kane's cruel game. He saw movement near the church. It was Eliza carrying a basket, likely on her way to deliver a meal to one of the older townsfolk. Her face was etched with worry, but when she saw him, a wave of relief washed over her features. She hurried toward him, her skirts kicking up dust. "Jack, you're back, and the whole town is on edge. There are rumors." "The rumors are true, Eliza," he said, his voice grim. "This man Silas Kane, he came here for me. But why? What could he possibly want with you?" Her honey-colored eyes were full of genuine confusion. She saw him only as the blacksmith, the quiet, solitary man who sometimes forgot to eat. He owed her the truth, at least a part of it. "Before I came to Redemption, I was a U.S. Marshal. I was part of a gunfight years ago. A young man was killed. Silas is his brother." The color drained from her face. "Oh, Jack." The way she said his name, filled with a sorrow that was for him and not of him, cracked something in his armor. "So, this is all for revenge?" "It's more than that," Jack said, his gaze sweeping the shuttered street. "He's not just trying to kill me. He's trying to destroy everything I've tried to build. This town, this peace. He's been here for months, buying up loans, foreclosing on properties. Sheriff Miller told me last night. Kane owns the mortgage on the general store, the livery, half the homesteads in the valley. He owns Redemption, and the people don't even know it yet." Eliza looked stunned, horrified. "He owns, but how?" "Fear and greed. The two oldest tools in the devil's workshop." Jack's hands clenched into fists. "He's turned the people against me, made them believe I'm the source of their troubles. When he finally makes his move, they'll be too scared or too indebted to stand with the law. They'll stand by and watch him burn it all down." "No." Eliza said, her voice firm, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "The people of this town are good. They're just frightened. They need a leader. They need you to remind them what this place stands for." Her faith in him was a heavy, undeserved weight. "The man they need died 5 years ago, Eliza." "I don't believe that," she said, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Her touch was a small point of warmth in his cold, chaotic world. "That man is still in there. He just needs to believe it himself." Before he could respond, the sky began to change. The clear morning blue was being consumed by a roiling, ugly brown cloud that swept in from the west. The wind picked up, howling like a vengeful spirit, whipping dust and debris through the streets. A dust storm. One of the bad ones that could strip paint from a wagon and last for days. It was as if the heavens themselves were reflecting the turmoil that was about to be unleashed upon the town. As the first gusts hit, sending townsfolk scurrying for cover, Jack saw them. Silas Kane and his remaining men, riding slowly, deliberately down the main street. They appeared out of the swirling brown haze like demons conjured from the earth. The storm was their ally, their curtain isolating Redemption from the outside world, turning the town into their private arena. "Get inside, Eliza, lock your door," Jack ordered, shoving her toward the schoolhouse. He ducked back into the smithy, his heart pounding a frantic, warlike rhythm. This was it. The final act. Silas was no longer hiding. He was making his claim. Through the gaps in the wallboards, Jack watched as Silas and his men dismounted in front of the saloon. They forced their way inside. A moment later, one of his men dragged Sheriff Miller out of his office and threw him into the saloon. Then they began rounding people up: the mayor, the owner of the general store, the town doctor Elias Vance. They were collecting the town's leadership, collecting his hostages. Then, to Jack's horror, two of the outlaws kicked open the door to the schoolhouse. They emerged moments later, dragging a struggling Eliza between them. They forced her across the street and into the saloon. Rage, pure and blinding, surged through Jack. This was his fault. He had spoken to her, put her in their line of sight. Silas, with his devilish cleverness, knew that the schoolteacher was Jack's one remaining link to the peaceful life he craved. He was systematically taking everything away. The saloon doors swung shut. The street was empty again, surrendered to the fury of the storm. The wind shrieked, rattling the windows of the smithy, kicking dust through the floorboards. Redemption was a ghost town now, its people held captive by their fear, its future held hostage in a saloon by a man consumed by a 5-year-old ghost. Jack knew he couldn't rush in. That's what Silas would expect. The hot-headed gunslinger riding to the rescue. He had to be smarter. He had to use the man he had become, the patient, methodical blacksmith, to guide the hand of the marshal. He looked around his smithy, his eyes falling on the tools of his trade. Hammers, tongs, heavy chains. The fire in the forge was down to glowing embers, but it wouldn't take much to bring it back to roaring life. An idea began to form, a desperate, dangerous plan, born of fire and iron. He worked with a feverish intensity, the clang of his hammer now a sound of defiance against the howling wind. He was not just mending broken things anymore. He was forging a weapon. He was forging redemption, not as a place, but as an act. The storm raged, turning day into a suffocating twilight. The air inside the saloon was thick with the smell of stale beer, fear, and unlit cigar smoke. Flickering oil lamps cast long, dancing shadows that made the room feel like a cage. Silas Kane stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with a clean rag, the picture of serene command. His hostages, Sheriff Miller, Mayor Thompson, Eliza, and a half-dozen other town leaders, were huddled together at a large table watched over by 4 grim-faced gunmen. Patience. Silas said, his voice calm and resonant, easily cutting through the scream of the wind outside. It is the virtue that separates the predator from the prey. Our friend Mr. Cade is a creature of instinct. He will come. But he will come when he believes the moment is his. He is, after all, a man who appreciates a dramatic entrance. Eliza stared at him, her fear warring with her defiance. "You're a monster," she said, her voice trembling but clear. Silas paused in his polishing and offered her a sad, theatrical smile. "My dear Miss Thorne, monster is a word used by the sheep to describe the wolf. It is a failure of imagination. I am not a monster. I am a man of singular, unwavering purpose. My brother Jacob was a boy with poetry in his soul. He followed me west seeking adventure, not a grave. Your Mr. Cade, in his righteous zeal, put a bullet through his heart without so much as a second thought. A footnote in a marshal's report. But to me, he was the whole story." He set the glass down with a delicate click. "So, you see, this is not cruelty. This is balance. An eye for an eye. A soul for a soul." The swinging doors of the saloon burst open, slamming against the walls. Jack Cade stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the swirling brown tempest outside. He held no gun in his hand. His face was a grim mask of soot and determination. "The play is over, Kane." Jack set his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very floorboards. "Let these people go." Silas chuckled, a rich, appreciative sound. "Ah, the hero arrives right on cue." "But you misunderstand, Cade. The play is just reaching its climax. This is where the protagonist is forced to make an impossible choice. Please come in. Join our little party. Jack stepped inside the doors, swinging shut behind him, plunging the room back into flickering gloom. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the positions of the gunmen, the fear on the faces of the hostages, the cold, confident amusement in Silas's eyes. "You're outnumbered, Jack." Sheriff Miller warned, his voice strained. "He has always been outnumbered." Silas countered smoothly. "That is his defining trait, is it not? The lone man against the world. It is the source of his legend, and tonight, the architect of his downfall." Silas gestured to a small table in the center of the room. On it he placed two objects. On one side, a stack of legal documents bound in twine, the deeds and mortgages he had acquired. On the other, the small silver locket. It seemed to absorb the lamplight, glowing with a soft, mournful luminescence. "The choice, Cade," Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "On my left, the future of this town, the lives and livelihoods of these good people. On my right, your past, the last tangible piece of the woman you failed to protect. You can only reach for one. If you reach for the locket, my men will execute these fine citizens, and you and I will settle our score. If you reach for the deeds, I will let everyone go, and you can have your precious town. But the locket, I will melt it down into a single worthless slug of silver. Your wife's memory will be erased. So what will it be? The ghost you can't let go, or the future you can't save?" It was a diabolical choice designed to shatter his soul no matter what he did. To choose the town was to desecrate Sarah's memory. To choose the locket was to condemn the innocent to death, proving he was the very monster Silas claimed him to be. Jack's gaze shifted from the locket to Eliza's face. Her eyes pleaded with him, but not for her own life. She was pleading for him, for his soul, trusting him to make the right choice. And in that moment, something inside Jack shifted. The guilt he had carried for 5 years, a crushing weight that had defined him, finally became something else, a source of strength. He had failed Sarah. He would not fail these people. "There's one more player in this scene you haven't accounted for, Kane." Jack said, his voice steady. He looked past Silas, his gaze locking on the town physician, Dr. Vance, who was sweating profusely despite the relative cool of the saloon. "Isn't that right, Doctor? You're the one who told him about the locket. You're the one who told him where the sheriff kept it. You're the one who sold out your neighbors for a share of his blood money." Vance went pale, his eyes wide with panic. "That's a lie. I found your telegrams in Purgatory Flats." Jack lied, his voice like flint. "The ones you sent to Kane, detailing my every move, my every conversation, detailing the town's finances. You betrayed them all." The doctor crumbled, sputtering denials that convinced no one. The other hostages stared at him with dawning horror and contempt. Silas merely smiled, a slow, predatory spreading of his lips. "Bravo, Cade. A clever bit of misdirection, but it changes nothing." "It changes everything," Jack said. He took a slow step toward the table. "You think my choice is between the past and the future. But you're wrong." He looked directly at the locket, at the gleaming silver that held so much pain. He spoke to it, to Sarah's memory. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he looked at Silas, his eyes clear and hard as diamonds. "My choice is to end this." He kicked the leg of the table. The locket and deeds flew into the air. In that split second of confusion, Jack moved. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He dove behind the heavy oak bar. The gunmen, startled, opened fire, their bullets chewing splinters from the wood-shattering bottles of whiskey and glass. The hostages screamed and dropped to the floor. Silas roared in frustration, his perfect scene descending into chaos. "He's behind the bar, get him." But Jack wasn't just hiding. With a powerful heave, he shoved the end of the bar. It was old and heavy, but not bolted to the floor. It pivoted, swinging out with incredible force, sweeping two of the gunmen off their feet with a sickening crunch of bone. As the third gunman turned, Jack was already moving. He vaulted over the bar, a heavy blacksmith's hammer appearing in his hand, as if from nowhere. He'd had it tucked in his belt at his back. He swung it in a low, brutal arc, connecting with the man's knee. The gunman shrieked and went down. Now it was just Jack Silas and his one remaining man. Silas shoved a table over, taking cover, his charismatic composure finally cracking, replaced by a mask of raw fury. "Kill him," he screamed at his last man. The outlaw raised his pistol, but a shot rang out from the hostage table. Sheriff Miller, who had managed to retrieve a dropped gun in the chaos, fired with the shaky but determined aim of an old lawman who had found his courage again. The last gunman fell. It was over in less than 30 seconds. The saloon was a wreck of shattered glass, splintered wood, and groaning men. The only two left standing were Jack and Silas, facing each other across the ruined room. The wind howled outside, a fitting soundtrack for the final confrontation. "You ruined my ending, Cade." Silas hissed, his face contorted with hate. He raised his pistol. Jack didn't flinch. He still held the hammer. "It was never your story to write." Silas fired. Jack twisted the bullet, searing a hot line across his ribs. He grunted in pain, but didn't fall. He threw the hammer with all the force of 5 years of pent-up grief and rage. It spun end over end, a blur of dark metal, and struck Silas square in the chest. The outlaw staggered back, the breath driven from his lungs, his shot going wide. Jack lunged forward, closing the distance, and drove his fist into Silas's jaw. The fight devolved into a primal, brutal brawl. They crashed over tables, their fists finding purchase, their grunts of pain lost in the storm. This wasn't a duel of legendary gunslingers. It was a desperate fight between two men haunted by the same ghost. Finally, Jack got the upper hand. He pinned Silas to the floor, his forearm pressed against his throat. He raised a fist to deliver the final blow, to beat the life out of the man who had caused so much pain. He looked down into Silas Kane's blazing, hate-filled eyes, and he saw not a monster, but a man broken by grief, just as he had been. He saw the face of Jacob Kane, the dead boy from the mountain pass. His fist faltered. Killing Silas wouldn't bring Sarah back. It wouldn't erase his guilt. It would only make him the man Silas wanted him to be. He let out a ragged breath and lowered his fist. He had won. Not by killing, but by choosing not to. He stood up, swaying from pain and exhaustion. Sheriff Miller and the other men surged forward, grabbing the defeated Silas Kane, hauling him to his feet. Jack looked around the devastated room. His gaze found Eliza. She was on her knees, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes shining with tears. He saw the silver locket lying on the floor near her, forgotten in the chaos. He walked over and picked it up. The metal was cool against his skin. He had saved the town. He had reclaimed the symbol of his past. But standing there in the wreckage, he realized he hadn't had to choose between them after all. By letting go of the vengeance that had defined him, he had managed to save both. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. A sliver of pale sunlight broke through the clouds, cutting a single dusty beam through the saloon's grimy window. It was over. The storm broke with the dawn, washing the air clean and leaving the world glistening and new. The fury had passed, leaving in its wake a profound and weary peace. The people of redemption emerged from their homes, blinking in the bright morning sun, to find their town battered but whole, their future secured. Silas Kane and his men, including the disgraced Dr. Vance, were locked in the town jail, awaiting the arrival of the federal marshals. The town council, led by a revitalized Sheriff Miller, was already poring over the deeds and mortgages Jack had recovered, undoing Silas's web of coercion and restoring ownership to the rightful families. The quiet heroism of the blacksmith was on everyone's lips. He was no longer the outsider, the lightning rod for trouble. He was the town's savior. Jack sat in his smithy, the fire in the forge cold. Eliza was there gently cleaning and bandaging the gash on his ribs. Her touch was tender, her silence comforting. The pain in his side was a dull, persistent ache, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his soul that was finally beginning to ease. "You were wrong," she said softly, her fingers pausing in their work. He looked at her, his expression questioning. "You said the man they needed died 5 years ago." She continued, meeting his gaze. "He didn't. He was just waiting. He was reforging himself just like you reforge steel, making himself stronger in the broken places." Her simple wisdom struck him with the force of a revelation. He had seen his life in redemption as a penance, an exile. But perhaps it had been a crucible burning away the rage and arrogance of his past, leaving behind something purer, stronger. When she finished, he stood up and walked to the anvil. The silver locket sat there gleaming in a ray of sunlight, slanting through the open door. He picked it up, its familiar weight settling in his palm. For 5 years, the memory of this locket had been a source of unbearable pain. Now it felt different. It was just a thing, a beautiful, precious thing, but a thing nonetheless. The love it represented was not contained within the metal. It was carried in his heart, a part of him that would never die, but one that no longer needed to be a wound. He left the smithy and began to walk, his steps slow but steady. He walked through the town, past people who now nodded to him with respect and gratitude. He walked past the schoolhouse, the church, and out to the edge of town, to the small, windswept hill that overlooked Redemption Valley. Sarah's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross he had carved himself. Wildflowers planted by Eliza grew at its base, their colors vibrant against the dark earth. He stood before it for a long time, the gentle breeze tugging at his hair. The words came slowly, haltingly spoken, not to the dead, but to the living memory within him. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm sorry I brought the violence to you. I'm sorry I wasn't there to protect you. I've carried that failure every day since." He opened his hand and looked at the locket. "I tried to hold on to you so tight," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought if I never let go of the pain, I'd never lose you. But I was wrong. I don't need this to remember you. You're a part of me." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I have to let you go now. I have to live. I think you'd want that." With his bare hands, he dug a small hole in the soft earth at the foot of the cross. He gently placed the locket inside its silver, a final bright farewell. He covered it with dirt, his hands packing the soil firmly, a final act of burial. He was not burying his wife. He was burying his guilt. He was laying a ghost to rest. He stood, wiping the dirt from his hands, and felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The heavy shroud of his past had been lifted. He turned to look back at Redemption, nestled in the valley below the morning sun, glinting off its rooftops. It looked like a promise. It looked like home. Waiting for him at the edge of the cemetery, standing by the simple wooden gate, was Eliza. She had followed him, giving him his space, but letting him know he wasn't alone. She held no pity in her eyes, only a deep, quiet understanding. He walked toward her, each step easier than the last. He was no longer Jack Cade, the haunted marshal, or Jack Cade, the penitent blacksmith. He was just Jack, a man who had faced his past and chosen his future. As he reached the gate, Eliza offered him a small, hopeful smile. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She simply held out her hand. He took it, her fingers lacing through his, a connection that was both new and felt as if it had always been there. Together, they walked back toward the town, toward the promise of a new day, a new beginning forged in the heart of a place called Redemption.